3 years of war. Is Ukraine now inching closer to peace? The leaders of France and the United Kingdom paid U.S. President Donald Trump a visit in Washington this week. Trade and tariffs were high on the agenda, but much of the discussion centered on ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. Here with more is former Florida congressman and former ambassador to the Vatican, Francis Rooney. Ambassador Rooney, President Trump has received a lot of criticism for the way he's treated Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. So is he justified?
Well, yeah, I think he is. I mean, Zelenskyy should have known better than to mix it up with the President of the United States, okay? He's living off of us. It has been since this thing first started. And I think a growing number of Americans want to find some way to terminate this thing instead of continue to dish out billions.
Well, the British and French are proposing a European force of peacekeepers to be placed in Ukraine and backed up by the U.S. military. So what do you think? Do you think Trump will go for that? What are your thoughts on that proposal?
Well, I agree with some of the things Trump has suggested, that there's no role for NATO in this, and that the Europeans need to provide the security arrangement to the Ukraine. It's their territory, it's their fight.
Well, so what do you think is going to happen here?
Well, I think that's a deal Zelensky's going to have to take.
Well, he's already said that he would be willing to negotiate some kind of deal on precious metals there, on some of the metal wealth in Ukraine with the U.S. What do you think of that one? Because we've spent, as Trump said, $360 billion on Ukraine.
I think that was a great idea. I mean, Trump's a business guy. You know, he says, we've given them all this money. Why they've got all these assets. Why don't we get some of them?
Well, and some people say that they haven't accounted for at least half of what we sent them. What are your thoughts on that?
You got to remember that before all this started back in 2016, Ukraine was considered one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Their borders were notoriously famous for thievery and things passing through without tariffs and contraband getting through. And that's why Trump upheld the missile shipments in 2017 until they kind of cleaned up their act a little bit.
Well, I saw one report that suggested Boris Johnson presented a peace proposal to Zelenskyy and Putin in March of 2022, a month after the war started. Zelenskyy rejected it. Is that true? And if so, why do you think he would reject that when he could have ended the war a month after it started, sparing hundreds of thousands of lives and that massive destruction to his country?
I've heard that both Macron and Johnson talked about some peace solutions, not without technical details. But the problem for Zelenskyy is he doesn't have the horsepower to try to do what he's trying to accomplish, and he doesn't seem to want to admit that. If he thinks he's going to get Russia out of Crimea, he's living in some alternate reality.
Yeah, I think most people don't think that's ever going to happen. So how does this war end? Zelenskyy says he'll step aside if NATO is allowed, if Ukraine is allowed to join NATO. So isn't that one reason why Putin invaded, that and EU membership?
Well, I don't think we have any business expanding NATO anymore. There's a legitimate question of whether we've already expanded it more than the American people would support their treaty obligations for.
So why do you think we want to expand it then?
I don't think we do.
Okay.
I don't think we have any business letting the Ukraine in NATO. I think that's going to be an absolute requirement of Putin, that and staying in Crimea. But I think, you know, maybe there's a solution more like the North and South Korea deal with a European peacekeeping force and a border there in the Donbass somewhere, Crimea, and everybody goes away peacefully instead of more the Hitler into Czechoslovakia solution.
So you don't see NATO membership for Ukraine happening. So what security guarantees could be given short of that without U.S. troops? Just Europe or?
Yeah, I think the Europeans, I think it's kind of their fight.
So do you think it's better for us to talk with Russia or to ignore Putin?
You know, I always think it's better for leaders to talk. I mean, you can't solve anything without communication, and you can't have any kind of relationship without communication. That doesn't mean anything will go of it very often, or maybe never. But the fact that Trump and Putin can discuss this now, where there has been any discussion for 4 years, is a major improvement.
Well,
and
then
there's bound to be a way for a solution to be had that includes Russia keeping Crimea, no NATO, maybe Zelenskyy gets back a little bit of the Donbass.
Well, I was going to ask you, what does Russia need to give up? After all, this war is really a stalemate. There's no clear victor.
Yeah, but I think that the cards are pretty well on the table that the longer this thing goes, the more Ukraine will suffer more than Russia.
And I can't let you go without asking about Pope Francis. He's in critical condition at the age of 88. You were ambassador to the Vatican. Your thoughts on his papacy and potential successors?
Well, his papacy has certainly been a little more liberal than his predecessors, the two John Pauls and the Paul VI, and then Benedict, who I was fortunate enough to serve with. He's taken the church in a much more liberation theology direction, more focused on north-south dialogue and discrepancies of wealth instead of doctrine. And hopefully we'll get someone that will go back to being a little more theological and doctrinaire. I'm kind of rooting for Cardinal Parolin, since Parolin was the guy that I talked to maybe 4 days a week the whole time I was over there, and his job is being in charge of all the ambassadors in the Holy See Secretary of State. And I've stayed in touch with him, and every time I go to Rome, I go have a nice meeting with him, and it'd be fantastic if he got in. He's super smart, and he's not a super liberal like this Pope, but he's not probably as conservative as Benedict.
Okay, we're all praying for the Pope, I'm sure. Ambassador Francis Rooney, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.